It was August 2024, and the sun hung low over the Lamar Valley, casting a golden glow across the wide expanse of sagebrush and scattered pines. The river flowed steadily, its surface glinting in the late afternoon light, whispering as it curved through the valley. It was a perfect day, warm but not stifling, the air alive with the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. 13-year-old Lily Thompson moved ahead with an eager bounce, her hiking boots pressing into the soft dirt along the riverbank. She had always loved the outdoors, and with its untamed beauty, the national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming felt like a world away from the noise of home. Jennifer, her mother, walked a few paces behind, watching her daughter with quiet amusement. She was cautious, always scanning their surroundings, but there was no real sense of danger, just the peaceful hum of the wild. They had spent the afternoon meandering along the river, pausing to skip stones and marvel at the sheer vastness of the land. Lily was interested in the animal tracks that crisscrossed the muddy banks. Deer, elk, and even what looked like wolf prints. Each imprint is a silent reminder of the creatures that called this place home. It felt like an adventure, a chance to step into something raw and untamed. Then, just as they rounded a bend, Jennifer saw it. A grizzly, massive and heavy with muscle, stood near the water's edge, its thick fur blending deep brown and sunlit gold. It was rummaging through the river stones, perhaps searching for fish, its powerful claws easily raking the pebbles aside. A moment later, the movement behind it confirmed Jennifer's fear. Two small cubs, their fur still slightly shaggy, clumsily nosing around near their mother's legs. Jennifer's pulse quickened. The bear hadn't noticed them yet. It was focused on its task, with its head down relaxed, but that could instantly change. Instinct took over as Jennifer reached for Lily, gripping her wrist and slowly stepping back. She kept her movements controlled and her breathing steady, doing exactly what she had read in every safety guide. No sudden movements, no panic. But Lily hesitated, her eyes locked on the bear with fascination and fear. Her sudden stiffness sent a shiver of tension through Jennifer's body, and then it happened. A rock, dislodged by Lily's heel, tumbled down the slope and struck another with a sharp clack. The bear's head snapped up at this, and it charged. It closed the distance fast, crashing through the underbrush. Jennifer barely reacted before it slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Lily's scream barely escaped before a massive paw struck her side. The blow sent her tumbling toward the riverbank, the impact driving air from her lungs. Then the thick claws gripped her jacket. The world tilted as she was dragged toward the river, her hands scrabbling against dirt, grasping at rocks, roots, anything. The bear was too strong. Its breath was hot, thick with the scent of earth and decay. Jennifer was already up, scrambling forward, desperate, clawing at the bear's flank. Her hands beat against the beast's thick fur, her nails digging in, trying everything. But it was like hitting a wall of muscle. The bear barely reacted. Lily's body twisted as she kicked, her boots slamming against the animal's snout. It only made things worse. The bear snarled, its jaws flashing down, clamping onto her shoulder. Pain exploded through her as she was lifted, her small frame flailing helplessly. Jennifer lunged, grabbing her daughter's legs and pulling with everything she had. The river roared behind them, and for a brief moment there was a horrible tug-of-war, Jennifer pulling one way, the bear the other. Then the bear gave a vicious shake. Lily's scream cut through the valley. Jennifer lost her grip. She watched horror as the bear spun, dragging Lily straight into the river. Water exploded around them, sending ripples through the current. Jennifer stumbled forward, plunging into the freezing water, her hands reaching and grabbing. But the bear was relentless. It pinned Lily beneath its weight, her small body thrashing wildly. The river churned red. Jennifer fought, her arms crashing against the bear's back, her fingers digging, her screams lost in the roar of water and wind. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. But the bear did not yield. It was nature, raw and merciless, unmoved by her desperation. Lily's struggles weakened. Her head slipped beneath the surface. The river carried them both farther, deeper. Jennifer lunged again, her fingers brushing her daughter's jacket, but it was too late. The current took her, pulling her limp body downstream. Jennifer collapsed onto the bank, gasping and shaking. Satisfied, the bear turned and lumbered back toward its cubs. It was over. The world felt impossibly still. Somewhere, the wind continued whispering slowly through the grass. The river moved uncaring, smoothing its surface as if nothing had happened. Birds still called from the trees, their songs unchanged and unbroken. It was hours before help arrived. The search team scoured the river, but they already knew the outcome. When they found Lily's body tangled among the rocks, her jacket torn, her skin pale beneath the fading light, the truth settled like a weight no one could lift. Jennifer sat on the bank, staring at the water. The memory of her daughter's last moments burned into her mind. The park rangers spoke in hushed tones, their faces grim, but their words barely registered. Nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could reverse the brutal indifference of the wild. The bear was tracked the next morning and shot by authorities. A necessary act, they said, but Jennifer knew it didn't matter. The valley would go on, just as it always had, just as it always would. The river would still run, the wind would still whisper, and somewhere, another mother bear would lead her cubs down to the water's edge. But her daughter can never be alive again. In June 2024, the vast wilderness of Kamchatka stretched endlessly before Natalia Ivanova. In this land, towering volcanoes loomed over valleys of thick forest, and icy rivers cut through the rugged terrain. Natalia had always found solace in places like this, far from the city's noise and the confinement of walls and schedules. She had hiked many trails across Russia, but Kamchatka held a special place in her heart. Something almost sacred about its isolation was the way the land felt raw and unbroken. She had been trekking for hours, her boots pressing firm into the mossy ground, the weight of her backpack familiar on her shoulders. Occasionally she paused to take in the view, allowing herself to be swallowed by the sheer magnitude of the wilderness. She decided to rest in one such moment of stillness, settling onto a flat rock overlooking a vast valley. Pulling out her phone, she was surprised to find a weak signal, rare in these parts, a fleeting connection to the outside world. Without hesitation, she called her husband Sergei back in St. Petersburg. The moment his voice filled her ears, a smile touched her lips. She described the view, the sweeping mountain ridges painted in the soft light of the late afternoon sun, the way the mist curled along the peaks, and the comforting and humbling silence. She could hear the warmth in his voice as he listened, a distant thread connecting them across the vastness of Russia. She was so focused on their conversation, on the simple pleasure of sharing this moment with him, that she didn't notice the shift in the air behind her. Deep in the forest, something moved, silent, deliberate. A presence slipping through the shadows, unnoticed in its approach. The Russian grizzly bear had been watching her for some time, its massive form blending into the dense greenery, its dark eyes locked onto the lone figure perched on the rock. It moved with eerie stillness, its powerful muscles rolling beneath thick fur, its enormous paws pressing soundlessly into the earth. The wind masked its scent, carrying it away before Natalia could sense the danger. Then, with terrifying speed, it closed the distance. Natalia only realized something was wrong when the hairs on her neck prickled, a sudden instinctive awareness that she was no longer alone. The feeling was immediate and suffocating, an invisible weight settling onto her chest. She turned. The bear was upon her. A wall of fur, muscle, and sheer brute force erupted from the undergrowth like a real nightmare. Her breath caught, a shockwave of terror surging through her veins. She scrambled backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. But there was no time to react, no time to think. The bear struck. The impact was unlike anything she had ever felt. It was a force so immense that it sent her crashing onto the uneven ground, her phone slipping from her grasp and tumbling onto the moss. Her limbs flailed as she tried to push herself away, and her breath came in ragged gasps. But the bear was relentless. A massive paw slammed down, claws raking across her jacket, tearing through fabric like paper. Pain shot through her body, sharp and electric. She kicked, twisted, and fought against the weight crushing her down, but the bear was overpowering, an unshakable force of nature. Her screams cut through the stillness, raw and desperate, echoing through the valley, carrying into the void. Her phone, still connected, lay just inches away, Sergei's voice lost in the chaos. The bear's jaws clamped down. Agony ripped through her as teeth pierced flesh, locking onto her shoulder and dragging her like a rag doll. Her body spasmed, hands clawing at the earth, nails breaking as she struggled. Blood soaked into the ground beneath her, the scent of iron thick in the air. She fought, her survival instincts thrashing against the inevitable. Her wild, primal determination surged, but the bear showed no mercy. It shook her violently, her vision blurring with its sheer force. Her mind screamed for air, for escape, for anything but this. The phone crackled. Sergei's voice, a distant ghost, unheard beneath the snarls and gasps. Then the device slipped into silence as the call was cut off. The struggle slowed. Her limbs weakened. The pain became distant, her senses dulling as her body failed her. The forest around her blurred, the towering trees bending and twisting, the sky above a vast, indifferent expanse. The bear did not stop. Long after her body had gone limp, long after her breath had faded into nothing, it remained, tearing into flesh, devouring. The wilderness knew no cruelty, no malice, only hunger, only survival. Hours later, rescue teams arrived. What remained of Natalia was barely recognizable, scattered remnants of a life once full of warmth and adventure, now reduced to silence. The bear was found the next morning, tracked down and euthanized. This decision was necessary, a reminder that Kamchatka's beauty was not without its dangers. Sergei never recovered from the sound of that final call. It haunted him, the helplessness of listening to her last moments, unable to reach her, unable to save her. Kamchatka remained unchanged, its mountains standing tall, its rivers flowing undisturbed. The wind carried no memory of what had transpired. The land continued as it always had. On the crisp morning of March 3, 2025, breakfast was in full swing at the prestigious Golden Tiger Hotel, one of Russia's finest retreats, perched at the edge of Primorye's vast, forested wilderness. Outside, towering pines stood like sentinels, their branches still kissed by the fading remnants of winter. Inside, the grand breakfast hall pulsed with life, the soft hum of conversation, the rhythmic chime of silverware against porcelain, and the intoxicating fusion of rich coffee, sizzling bacon, smoked fish, and golden fried eggs filling the air. Svetlana Orlova, a journalist from Vladivostok, sat near the buffet, sipping her tea as she scrolled through her phone, absently spearing a piece of bacon with her fork. Across from her, Mikhail Petrov, a businessman in his late 40s, checked his watch, his mind already occupied with the meetings he had scheduled for the day. Around them, guests lingered over their meals, enjoying the warmth of the dining room while the cold wind howled just beyond the glass windows. It was no wonder that no one heard the first sign of danger, the faint creak of wood giving way, the slow splintering of a doorframe. It wasn't until the heavy crash of something massive breaking through the kitchen entrance echoed through the hotel that heads turned, confusion flickering across their faces. The sound of metal pans clattering to the floor added to the chaos, and then a deafening roar sent ice down the spines of every guest and worker in the hall. The kitchen door slammed open, and a monstrous shape lurched into the main entrance. It was a Russian grizzly bear, one of the most dangerous creatures on the planet. The animal was enormous, its black eyes, wild and unfocused, swept across the room as it bared yellowed teeth, its snout twitching with the scent of food. Nobody knew how to react at first. The first scream was what sent the bear charging. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests scrambled away from their tables, dishes smashing against the tiles as trays were overturned in blind panic. Svetlana shoved back from her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs as the bear swung its massive head in her direction. Before she could take a step, the beast lunged. A wall of fur, muscle, and raw power sent her crashing to the ground, her body pinned beneath the predator's weight. A hot burst of pain seared through her flesh as the bear's claws raked into her back. The bear's growl drowned a strangled gasp in her throat. Mikhail barely rose from his chair when the grizzly turned on him next. He tried to run, but the beast was faster. It slammed a paw into his chest, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The wind was knocked from his lungs as the bear descended upon him, massive jaws closing around his shoulder, crushing bone with a sickening crunch. Blood pooled beneath him, his body convulsing in agony as if gripped by seizures. Screaming guests shoved past one another. They were desperate to escape the carnage, but the bear, frenzied now, whirled around and looked for its next target. A group of 3 guests, led by an elderly man named Dmitry Ivanov, sprinted toward the restrooms, shoving inside and slamming the door shut just as the bear charged. They pressed themselves against the far wall, hearts pounding, hands clasped over their mouths to stifle terrified breaths. But the bear was relentless. It reared up on its hind legs and threw its full weight against the flimsy wooden door, the force rattling the walls, the hinges groaning under the strain. With a final splintering crack, the door gave way. The bear surged forward, its bulk filling the narrow space. Blood-slicked claws slashed at Dmitri, ripping into his side, the impact sending him crashing into the sinks. A second guest tried to crawl away, but the bear caught her by the leg, dragging her back as her fingers clawed uselessly at the floor. The last person in the room, a teenage boy, could do nothing but press himself into the corner, paralyzed with terror as the beast's snarling maw closed over his throat. The beast returned to the dining hall, where hotel staff had armed themselves with whatever they could find. Fire extinguishers, chairs, kitchen knives, but nothing deterred the rampaging predator. A cook aimed a blast of white foam at the bear's face, hoping to blind it, but the beast barely flinched. Outside, sirens wailed. The crazed and agitated bear prowled back through the dining area's wreckage, stepping over broken dishes and overturned tables, its breath ragged, its hunger unsatisfied. A shot rang out, shattering a window. The bear jerked its head up. Its nostrils flared in apprehension. A second shot tore through its shoulder, a burst of dark blood spraying against the tiled floor. The beast snarled, but another bullet struck true, piercing its skull. The massive form crumpled, collapsing. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds, the panicked sobs of the survivors, the shallow gasps of those too injured to scream. Police officers stormed in, weapons raised, eyes wide as they took in the devastation. Bodies lay strewn across the floor, lifeless forms in pools of crimson. Survivors clung to one another, trembling, their eyes glazed with shock. The aftermath was a scene of horror. Broken furniture, smeared blood, and still bodies. Emergency responders worked frantically, checking pulses, calling names, searching for anyone still breathing. A total of 5 guests lost their lives in the attack. Later, as investigators examined the bear's remains, experts pointed to the warming temperatures and the early thaw disrupting the predator's hibernation cycle. Hunger and confusion had driven it from the depths of the forest into the heart of human civilization, where instinct had turned to violence. But for those who had witnessed the carnage firsthand, for the staff, who would never forget the sight of the dining hall transformed into a slaughterhouse, for the families who would never see their loved ones again, no explanation would ever be enough. It was an early afternoon on March 2nd, 2025, deep inside a remote forest outside Boulder, Colorado. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the towering evergreens swaying gently in the wind. High above the ground, Steve Williams moved with practiced precision, his harness secure around his waist as he maneuvered through the branches of a towering lodgepole pine. At 42, he had spent most of his life cutting trees, his body conditioned to the strain of long days spent at dizzying heights. Steve adjusted his footing, glancing down at the clearing below. His crew was scattered across the worksite, each man focused on his task. The whine of chainsaws echoed through the forest, sharp and relentless. Logs lay stacked neatly. Suddenly, Steve saw movement out of the corner of his eye. At first, the man thought it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light or a shadow shifting among the trees. But when he focused, he saw a black bear, large and dark, stepping cautiously into the clearing. Its head was low, ears twitching as it sniffed the air. Steve marveled at the sight. Black bears, he knew, were shy creatures afraid of noise and people. So why was this one coming closer to the noise instead of hiding away? Encounters with wildlife weren't uncommon in this line of work. Steve figured it would take one whiff of gasoline and human sweat and move along, but the bear lingered, circling the base of the tree. Steve tightened his grip on a thick branch, his senses suddenly sharpening. The bear wasn't just passing through, Steve was sure of it. It was watching him. The chainsaw buzzed in his hands, the blade slicing effortlessly through a thick limb. He kept working, hoping the noise would drive the animal off. The vibrations traveled through the tree, shaking the trunk. Still, the bear stayed. It moved slowly, its black eyes locked onto him as if weighing a decision. It reared onto its hind legs. A bolt of unease shot through Steve's body. Bears were talented climbers, and this one was reaching, testing the bark with its claws. A second later, it started climbing. Steve's pulse hammered. He knew he was in trouble. The higher branches wouldn't support his weight, and the bear was strong, its thick claws sinking effortlessly into the trunk. Steve moved fast, pushing upward, searching for anything to give him a better hold. His safety harness restricted his movement, slowing him down. He heard the deep huff of the bear below. The tree was trembling under the bear's weight, and then claws slashed at his boots. Steve kicked out desperately, but the bear kept climbing. Its teeth snapped inches from his leg, tearing into fabric. Adrenaline surged through Steve's veins as he swung the chainsaw around. He revved the engine, the high-pitched roar cutting through the air. He angled it downward, hoping the sound would send the bear scrambling back down, but it didn't. The bear lunged. A massive paw struck his arm, knocking the chainsaw from his grip. The heavy tool tumbled through the branches, bouncing off the trunk before crashing into the undergrowth below. Steve barely had time to react before the bear struck again. The impact jarred his grip loose. His fingers slipped from the rough bark. His harness twisted as he lost his balance. Then he fell some 15 feet down. His body twisted midair before he slammed into the ground with bone-jarring force. The wind was knocked from his lungs. Pain exploded through his back and ribs. Stars danced across his vision. He tried to move, but it was no use. The bear followed suit, climbing down with astonishing speed. Steve gasped as its claws sliced his back open. Teeth clamped onto his shoulder, puncturing through his jacket, through skin, through muscle. He could feel the pain and the pressure, but the sensations were muted, lost into the damage caused by the fall. He only half heard a sudden burst of noise. The bear flinched. His co-workers were shouting, Steve realized. The bear released him. Dazed, Steve rolled onto his side, gasping for air, his vision swimming. The bear backed away, its head snapping toward the source of the commotion. One of his co-workers, a burly man in an orange vest, was waving a metal toolbox over his head, slamming it against the side of the logging truck. Others had joined in, stomping, shouting, making as much noise as possible. The bear disappeared back into the forest. Steve lay still, his body trembling. He tried to sit up, but collapsed back against the dirt. Blood seeped from his wounds, staining the earth beneath him. Footsteps pounded toward him. Hands gripped his shoulders, voices calling his name. The world tilted, faces blurring in and out of focus. Someone pressed a jacket against his wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. A siren wailed in the distance. His co-workers spoke in hushed, anxious voices. They urged him to stay awake. The paramedics arrived minutes later, moving fast, checking his vitals and stabilizing him. They loaded him onto a stretcher, their voices calm but firm. He was alive, but barely. As they carried him toward the ambulance, Steve tilted his head slightly, looking toward the tree he had fallen from. The chainsaw still lay in the undergrowth, forgotten. Steve was rushed to the hospital, where he made a full recovery. It was a miracle. He survived a bear attack and a 15-foot fall. Even more, Steve managed to return to work. But for the rest of his life, whenever he climbed, heard the hum of a chainsaw, and stood among the trees, he would remember the feeling of being afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the winding expanse of Highway 395 as it cut through the rugged landscapes near a national park in the southern Sierra Nevada, east of Visalia, California. The Davis family, John, Linda, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Caroline and 8-year-old Robert, were making their way home after a week-long road trip through California's national parks, their SUV packed with camping gear, half-eaten snacks, and the lingering scent of pine and campfire smoke. The trip had been everything they had hoped for: breathtaking views, quiet hikes beneath towering sequoias, and memories that could only be made under star-strewn skies. As they rounded a bend, the road stretched before them, empty save for a single dark shape moving along the shoulder. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow against the golden light of dusk, but as they drew closer, it took form. It was a black bear, its thick fur rippling as it ambled across the gravel, nose twitching as it searched for scraps. Sitting in the front passenger seat, Linda instinctively reached for her phone, eager to capture the moment and share it with her friends online. Caroline and Robert pressed their faces against the glass, their voices rising excitedly. Ever the cautious driver, John slowed to a near stop, his hands firm on the wheel as he kept a wary eye on the animal. He had read enough warnings to know that bears along the highway had become bolder in recent years, drawn to roadside litter and the scent of food left behind by passing travelers. The bear paused, lifting its head. For a heartbeat, it stood motionless, its powerful body rigid with an intensity that sent a faint ripple of unease through the air. Then, without warning, it started running toward them. The sudden burst of movement was shocking. Its paws slammed against the side of the SUV, the impact rocking the vehicle as Caroline and Robert shrieked in terror. Clawed feet scraped against metal, the sound grating and sharp, followed by the dull thud of its massive weight pressing against the doors. Linda barely had time to react before a shadow loomed at her window, her pulse spiking as she realized, too late, that it was partially opened. Thick, curved claws hooked around her arm, rough pads pressing against her skin as a sudden inhuman force yanked her forward. She was pulled, her body twisting painfully. A scream tore from her throat as she clung to the edge of the door, her fingernails scraping against metal, but the bear was relentless. Its strength far beyond anything she could resist. The pressure on her arm was unbearable, muscles straining, tendons burning, skin tearing beneath the brutal grip. John reacted without hesitation. His mind, a blur of panic and desperation, seized on the nearest weapon within reach, the tire iron tucked beneath the driver's seat. His hands closed around the cold metal, his knuckles white as he tore it free and swung with all the force he could muster. The iron struck the bear's shoulder with a dull, sickening thud, but it barely flinched. Linda's body lurched further out of the vehicle, her shoulder twisting at an unnatural angle as she let out another cry of pain. John swung again. This time the blow landed higher, cracking against the side of the bear's skull. A deep, guttural snarl erupted from its throat, a sound raw with anger and pain. It released Linda just long enough for her to collapse back into the car, her arm hanging limp, blood trickling from deep, jagged wounds. But the bear wasn't finished. It reared onto its hind legs, its massive frame towering over the SUV as it slammed its paws onto the hood, denting the metal with the sheer force of its weight. The front windshield splintered, fine cracks spreading like a spider's web across the glass. Inside, the children sobbed, their bodies pressed as far back into their seats as they could go, their small hands gripping each other in blind terror. John threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the pavement as he fought to distance them from the frenzied animal. The SUV lurched backward, but the bear wasn't letting go so easily. It dropped to all fours, muscles bunching as it prepared to lunge again. Then suddenly, it stopped. For a moment it stood there, breathing heavily, its sides heaving with exertion. Then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it turned away, retreating toward the trees with slow, deliberate steps. John didn't wait to question why. He hit the gas, the SUV lurching forward, tires spinning as they sped down the highway, leaving the bear behind in the fading light. Linda cradled her injured arm against her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face pale from shock and blood loss. The children's cries filled the cabin, their voices trembling with fear and disbelief. By the time they reached the nearest hospital, Linda was barely conscious, her body shaking from the rapid loss of blood. The doctors worked quickly, stabilizing her, stitching the deep lacerations, setting the bones that had fractured under the bear's brutal grip. Hours later, when she woke, she found John sitting beside her, his face etched with exhaustion and guilt. Their children curled up in chairs at the foot of the bed, too afraid to let her out of their sight. In the days that followed, wildlife officials tracked the bear, analyzed the scene, and tried to determine what had driven it to attack so aggressively. The conclusion was grim but unsurprising: food scarcity. The past season had been unkind to the bears in the region, with drought conditions limiting their access to natural resources, forcing them closer to human territory, and making them more desperate and dangerous. Linda would recover, though the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain. And though time would dull the sharp edges of their fear, the Davis family would never again look at the wilderness with the same awe-struck wonder. They had seen the thin line between beauty and brutality, between the wild and the world they thought they understood, and they would never forget how quickly that line could shatter. In March 2025, the cold winds of Siberia swept across the dense forests near Taiga, Russia. A police team of 6 officers, led by Dmitry Zaitsev, was assigned to patrol the remote roads near the forest. The experienced law enforcement members had spent the entire day responding to reports of illegal hunting in the area. As the sun set, they took a short break, parking their police van near the edge of the dense woods. The team, including officers Mikhailov, Ivanov, Petrov, Sokolov, and Lebedev, had worked together for years. They were used to harsh conditions, long hours, and the unpredictable dangers of the wild. Despite the risks of patrolling such an isolated region, they remained confident in their abilities. Their vehicle was sturdy, their weapons were loaded, and their training had prepared them for nearly every scenario. But nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Unbeknownst to them, a starving Russian grizzly bear had desperately searched the forest for food. The harsh winter had left it weak and ravenous. The scent of food from the officers' supplies attracted the massive animal, leading it to their parked van. It remained hidden among the trees, watching and waiting for a while. Then, driven by hunger, it made its move. Without warning, the enormous bear charged at full speed, slamming into the side of the van with incredible force. The metal groaned under the impact as the officers, startled by the sudden noise, reached for their weapons. But before they could react, the bear had already torn through the door. Dmitry Zaitsev was the first to be grabbed, his body yanked from the vehicle in a matter of seconds. His desperate screams echoed through the cold air as the bear sank its teeth into him, dragging him away from the van. Mikhailov managed to grab his rifle, but before he could fire, the bear knocked the weapon from his hands and clamped its jaws down on his shoulder, tearing into his flesh. The other officers, now in a full state of panic, grabbed whatever they could: batons, knives, even their bare hands. But the bear was unstoppable. Ivanov and Petrov attempted to escape through the back door, but the bear turned its fury on them next. Claws and teeth ripped through their bodies as they struggled to break free. Sokolov and Lebedev tried to fight, but the sheer size and strength of the bear overwhelmed them. Within minutes, the last of the officers fell, their bodies left lifeless inside and around the van. By the time the sun had completely set, silence had returned to the forest. The once active police unit was gone. The bear, now covered in blood, stood victorious over the destruction it had caused. The remote Siberian landscape held no witnesses, and hours would pass before anyone realized what had happened. The bodies of the 6 officers remained in and around the police van as the night grew colder. The grizzly bear, still hungry, lingered nearby, occasionally sniffing the ground before retreating into the forest. Hours passed without disturbance. The radio inside the vehicle crackled with incoming messages, but no one was left to answer. Concern grew at the Taiga Police Department when the officers failed to check in. Repeated attempts to contact them went unanswered. A second patrol team was dispatched before dawn to investigate. The roads leading to the forest were covered in a thin layer of frost, slowing the journey. The officers, expecting nothing more than a simple vehicle breakdown, were unprepared for the sight that awaited them. As the first rays of sunlight touched the treetops, the rescue team arrived at the scene. The van's side door was torn apart, and deep claw marks were visible along the metal frame. Nearby, the officers' weapons and personal belongings were scattered across the ground. Then, they saw the bodies. Dmitry Zaitsev's remains lay a few meters away from the van, partially buried in the snow, his uniform ripped apart. Mikhailov's body was slumped near the vehicle, his shoulder covered in deep bite wounds. The others were found nearby, their injuries severe and their faces barely recognizable. The team immediately called for reinforcements. Soon, more officers and medical personnel arrived, but they could do nothing. The entire unit had been wiped out. The brutal nature of the attack made it clear that no one had survived long enough to call for help. Authorities quickly launched a search for the bear responsible. Experienced trackers examined the area, following the large footprints leading into the trees. It did not take long to find the animal. The bear was still in the forest, resting near a patch of frozen ground. Its fur was stained with blood, and its movements were sluggish. When approached, it showed signs of aggression, but it was clear the animal was weak from starvation. A decision was made to put the bear down. Shots rang through the air, and within moments, the threat was eliminated. Wildlife experts later examined the bear's body and confirmed it had been struggling to find food due to the harsh winter. The deaths of the 6 officers sent shockwaves through the Taiga Police Department. Colleagues mourned their loss, and local news covered the tragic event for weeks. Authorities reminded residents of the dangers of wild animals, urging caution in remote areas. Special measures were taken to prevent similar attacks, including stricter patrol protocols and improved emergency response systems. The officers' families gathered for memorial services, honoring their bravery and dedication. In the forests of Siberia, the land remained unchanged, untouched by human grief. The tragedy became another reminder of nature's power and the harsh reality of life in the wild. In July 2024, Sam Whitaker, a dedicated and experienced park ranger, patrolled the vast wilderness of a national park in northwestern Montana. He had spent years protecting the park's wildlife and ensuring visitors remained safe. He knew the land well, from the deep forests to the cold mountain lakes. His work often took him into remote areas, where he monitored animal activity and checked for any signs of danger. The sun shone golden that morning as Sam set out on patrol. He carried his usual gear, including a radio, bear spray, and an emergency firearm. Though he had encountered many wild animals before, he always remained cautious. The national park was home to a large population of grizzly bears, and summer was a time when food became scarce, making some bears more aggressive. Sam noticed recent bear activity as he followed a narrow trail near a lake. Claw marks on trees and overturned rocks suggested that a large grizzly had been searching for food in the area. He remained alert, scanning his surroundings carefully. The sound of rustling bushes nearby made him stop. A massive grizzly bear stepped out of the trees, its powerful body towering over the ranger. Sam immediately recognized the bear's tense posture. It was not just curious, it was agitated. Likely struggling to find food, the bear saw Sam as a threat or a potential meal. Understanding the danger, he followed his training, slowly backing away to avoid startling the animal. However, the bear suddenly charged before he could create a safe distance. With only seconds to react, Sam turned and ran toward a nearby tree, hoping to climb to safety. But the bear was too fast. It slammed into him with immense force, knocking him off balance and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope toward the lake. The impact left him momentarily dazed, and before he could recover, the grizzly was upon him again, its powerful claws raking across his body. Desperate to escape, Sam tried to reach for his bear spray, but the bear struck again, sending them into the lake. The cold water engulfed them, and Sam struggled to swim away. The bear, however, was relentless. It grabbed him, dragging him beneath the surface, preventing him from resurfacing. Bubbles rose to the top as Sam kicked and fought, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. The lake quickly returned to its eerie stillness, the only remnants of the struggle being the disturbed water and the slowly fading ripples. The wilderness fell silent once more. Hours later, when Sam failed to respond to radio calls, a search team was dispatched to find him. Following his patrol route, they arrived at the lake, the site of the attack. What they discovered would send shockwaves through the park community. Moving cautiously along the water's edge, the team searched for any sign of Sam. His patrol route had led him straight to this spot, and the churned-up water suggested something violent had occurred. Then, one of the rangers spotted deep claw marks in the dirt near the slope. The ground was torn as if a fierce struggle had taken place. Scattered pieces of broken equipment lay nearby, confirming their worst fears. They called for additional support, and soon, more rescuers arrived with boats and diving gear. The lake's calm water did not reveal what lay beneath, but the search had to continue. One of the divers prepared to enter, knowing that time had already passed since the attack. The icy water made the search difficult, and visibility was low. After several minutes, a shadow appeared beneath the surface. The ranger had been found. The lifeless body of Sam Whitaker was pulled from the lake, his uniform torn and his skin marked by deep wounds from the bear's powerful claws and teeth. The weight of the loss hit everyone at once. Sam had been a skilled ranger dedicated to protecting the wilderness that had taken him. His colleagues stood in silence, processing the tragedy. The news of the attack spread quickly. People who had known Sam shared memories of his dedication and kindness. Visitors who had met him during their trips to the park remembered his knowledge and passion for nature. The entire community mourned the loss of someone who had always put others' safety first. Authorities tracked the bear that had killed Sam. It did not take long to locate, as it had remained near the area. Rangers followed the trail, and after careful planning, the bear was euthanized to prevent further attacks. The decision was not taken lightly, as conservation efforts in the park focused on protecting wildlife. However, once a bear displayed such extreme aggression, it became too dangerous to allow it to remain near humans. Sam's passing left a lasting impact on the national park in northwestern Montana. To prevent similar incidents in the future, officials reviewed safety guidelines, placed more warning signs in high-risk areas, and adjusted patrol procedures to protect rangers better. Training sessions were also increased, teaching staff and visitors how to respond to bear encounters. His family and friends held a memorial in his honor. They shared stories of his bravery, love for the outdoors, and years of service. A plaque was placed in the park to remember him, ensuring his dedication would never be forgotten. Though time passed, the memory of that day remained strong. The attack reminded visitors of the park's wild and unpredictable nature. Visitors continued to explore its beauty, but with greater caution and respect. Sam Whitaker's legacy lived on in the hearts of those who knew him and the very land he worked so hard to protect. In February 2025, a cold wind blew across Anchorage, Alaska, as families gathered at the Arctic Wildlife Zoo. Among the visitors was 10-year-old Ethan Larson, who had come with his parents and older sister. The zoo was one of his favorite places, and he had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Ethan loved animals, especially large and powerful ones like polar bears. He had read about them in books, watched documentaries, and even collected toy figures. Seeing them in real life was always exciting. The Arctic Wildlife Zoo was well known for its polar bear exhibit. It had a large open enclosure designed to resemble the bear's natural habitat, with icy pools and rocky terrain. Visitors could observe the bears from a safe viewing platform, separated by a tall glass barrier and a lower railing. The zoo had warning signs advising visitors not to lean over the barrier, but Ethan was too eager to get a closer look. As they approached the exhibit, Ethan rushed ahead of his family. His parents called for him to slow down, but his eyes were locked on the massive white bears moving through the snow-covered enclosure. The bears were fascinating, their thick fur shining under the winter sun. Ethan leaned over the railing, gripping the edge for a better view. His parents were a few steps behind, taking pictures of the exhibit. Ethan shifted his weight forward just a little too much without realizing it. His fingers slipped from the railing, and before he could react, his body tilted forward. The moment seemed to slow down as he lost his balance. A gasp echoed from the people around him. Ethan tumbled over the barrier instantly and plunged into the enclosure below. The fall was not long, but the impact was hard. Ethan hit the snowy ground, and his body landed with a thud. For a second, everything was silent. Then, panic spread through the crowd as people realized what had happened. His mother screamed his name, and his father ran toward the railing, his face frozen in shock. One of the polar bears turned its head toward the sudden movement inside the enclosure. It had been resting near the pool's edge, but now it was alert, watching the small figure that had entered its space. At first, the bear hesitated, but then it started moving toward Ethan. The boy scrambled to his feet, but there was nowhere to run. The enclosure walls were too high to climb, and the cold ground made it hard to move quickly. Zookeepers rushed to the scene, shouting and waving their arms to distract the bear. Some visitors grabbed their phones, calling for help, while others looked away, unable to watch. Now only a few steps away from Ethan, the bear lowered its head and advanced. The terrified boy had no escape. The crowd held its breath as the inevitable happened. The polar bear moved quickly, its powerful legs carrying it across the icy ground. Ethan tried to step backward, but his feet slipped on the snow. The bear reached him in seconds, knocking him down with a heavy paw. The force sent his small body rolling across the enclosure. Gasps and screams filled the air as visitors watched in horror. Zookeepers continued shouting, trying to distract the bear, but it was too late. The bear pins Ethan to the ground, its sharp claws tearing through his clothes. The boy struggles, his arms flailing as he tries to escape. From above, his parents cry out, their faces frozen in terror. Zoo staff grab equipment, but there is no easy way to reach the enclosure floor in time. Some employees rush to unlock a gate leading inside, but every second feels too long. Within moments, the bear overpowers Ethan. Its massive jaws closed over him, and the struggle stopped. The boy's small frame lay still in the snow. Zookeepers fired noise-making devices to scare the bear away. It hesitated before finally backing off, leaving Ethan motionless on the cold ground. Rescue teams arrived within minutes, but the damage had already been done. Ethan was lifeless, his body marked by deep wounds. Paramedics checked for any sign of life, but they could do nothing. A heavy silence fell over the area as the reality of the situation set in. The zoo was immediately closed, and police launched an investigation. Authorities reviewed security footage and interviewed witnesses. Signs had been posted warning visitors to stay behind the safety barriers, but a small mistake had led to a tragic loss. Officials debated whether additional measures should be taken to prevent such accidents in the future. Ethan's family was devastated. His parents were in shock, unable to process what had happened. His sister, who had been just a few steps away when he fell, was overwhelmed with grief. The family had come for a fun day at the zoo, never imagining it would end in such heartbreak. News of the attack spread quickly, drawing national attention. Wildlife experts discussed the nature of polar bears, explaining that they are powerful predators that react instinctively to sudden movements. Some questioned whether the bear should be euthanized, but others argued that it was only following its natural behavior. In the end, zoo officials decided not to harm the animal, stating that it had not acted out of aggression, but rather out of instinct. A memorial was set up outside the zoo, where people left flowers, stuffed animals, and messages of support for Ethan's family. In the following weeks, parents who visited the zoo held their children's hands tighter, reminded of how unpredictable nature can be. The tragedy cast a long shadow over the community, leaving a deep and lasting impact. In the aftermath, park officials conducted thorough reviews of safety protocols, leading to stricter measures and reinforced barriers. Visitors, once carefree, now approached animal enclosures with a newfound caution, reminded of the fragile boundary between human curiosity and wildlife unpredictability. The heartbreaking loss of a young life served as a stark and painful lesson, a reminder of why these protective measures exist, not just for the safety of people, but also for the well-being of the animals that call the sanctuary home. The small, snow-covered town of Koryak lay under a thick blanket of clouds, the early morning sun doing little to warm the frozen air. It was February 10th, 2025, the kind of day where people moved quickly between buildings, eager to escape the cold. Most of the town's residents lived quiet lives, their routines shaped by the relentless winters and the isolation of their remote homes. They were used to the harsh conditions and the ever-present reality of nature creeping at the edges of their lives. But today, the balance between humans and the wild would tip into something unthinkable. Tatiana Orlov, a schoolteacher in her mid-40s, had stopped by the local grocery store to pick up bread and tea before heading home. She had lived in Koryak all her life, raising her 2 teenage sons alone after her husband died in a fishing accident. She had seen bears before. Everyone had, but they usually kept to the forests, driven away by noise and human presence. That morning, people had spoken about a Russian grizzly wandering too close to town, lingering near the outskirts, but no one had considered it an immediate threat. Winter was long, food was scarce, and hunger drove animals to strange places. Seeing desperate creatures lurking near the roads and searching for food was not unusual. It was something people acknowledged, but rarely feared. The store's owner, Alexei Petrov, had been stocking shelves when he first heard the disturbance. A strange, low groaning noise carried through the cold air, followed by the rhythmic crunch of something heavy moving across the snow. He looked up just in time to see a massive shape barreling toward the glass doors. When Alexei saw the blur of matted brown fur and the monstrous bulk moving with unnatural speed, he knew what was happening. In seconds, the glass shattered inward, the brittle surface offering no resistance as the beast forced its way inside the grocery store. The few shoppers inside froze. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling through the gaping entrance, accompanied by the crunch of broken glass beneath the bear's weight. But the stunned silence was soon shattered by a raw and jagged scream. The Russian grizzly, easily twice the size of a man, reared onto its hind legs, its massive head swinging from side to side at the sound. Its breath billowed in thick white clouds, nostrils flaring, eyes dark pits of hunger and rage. The scent of human bodies, food, and warmth must have driven it mad. It dropped onto all fours and charged. A man near the entrance didn't even have time to react before the bear was on him, a single swipe of its claws tearing through his chest and claiming his life with incredible ferocity. The man crumpled without a sound, blood spreading in thick pools around him. The sight sent the store into chaos. People ran in every direction, knocking over displays and shoving past one another in blind panic. Once neatly stocked with goods, the aisles became obstacles in a desperate race for survival. Those closest to the back tried to push through the storeroom doors, but in their frantic desperation, they clogged the exit, trapping themselves. Tatiana, the schoolteacher, turned and ran, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps. She saw an elderly woman ahead of her trip, her cane skidding across the floor, her frail body collapsing onto the tiles. But before Tatiana could help the woman, the bear lunged. A sickening crunch echoed through the store as the beast's powerful jaws clamped down, lifting the woman like a rag doll. It shook its head once, twice, then tossed her aside, her broken body sliding limply across the floor. The bear roared, the sound rattling the air, a warning that sent fresh waves of panic through the trapped shoppers. The store's owner, Alexei, tried to reach the shotgun he kept behind the counter for situations like this, but the bear moved faster than human reflexes could allow. It crashed into the register, its weight knocking over shelves, sending cans and boxes cascading to the floor. Alexei barely had time to raise an arm before the creature was on him, its claws raking down his torso, splitting flesh, exposing bone. He screamed, the sound high and shrill until the bear crushed his throat with a single brutal bite. His body twitched once, then went still. Another woman tried to escape through the loading dock, but the heavy door jammed, ice locking it in place. She banged against it, fists bruising against the metal, sobs racking her body. The bear turned its head at the sound, its instincts locking onto her fear. The animal charged, slamming into her with cold efficacy. Her scream ended in a gurgle as it sank its teeth into her back, tearing chunks of her flesh. By now, the aisles were slick with blood, the air thick with the coppery scent of death. Those who had managed to avoid the bear cowered in whatever spaces they could find, beneath shelves, behind counters, curled into corners, hands pressed to their mouths to stifle their terrified sobs. A man hidden inside a refrigerator display gripped his arms to keep from shaking, sweat freezing against his skin. The bear, frenzied now, crushed displays beneath its bulk, sniffing, seeking, its hunger insatiable. Sirens wailed in the distance, but in a town as isolated as Koryak, help never came quickly enough. When the first shots rang out, the bear barely flinched, the bullets embedding into its thick hide but failing to stop it. It turned, eyes locking onto the approaching figures. Local authorities armed with rifles, their hands shaking despite their training. The bear lunged, covering the distance between them in seconds. One officer managed a clean shot, the bullet striking the beast just below the eye, but even wounded, it kept coming, swiping at anything in its path. Another shot rang out, then another. The bear staggered, its growl turning into a deep, rattling snarl. Blood poured from its wounds, its movements slowing. It swayed, nostrils flaring, steam rising from its body. Then, with one final shuddering breath, it collapsed onto the blood-stained floor, its lifeless eyes still locked in a rage-filled glare. The store stood in ruins, littered with bodies, broken shelves, and shattered glass. The silence that followed was suffocating. 9 lives were lost that day, each one leaving an emptiness that would mark the town for generations to come. Families shattered, futures erased in minutes. The survivors would never forget the horror, the way death had come so suddenly, so violently. In the days that followed, the town would mourn and try to understand how such a thing had happened. People would speak of dramatic shifts in animal behavior, food shortages, and growing tension between man and the wild. But for those who had been there, who had heard the screams, seen the blood, felt the terror in their bones, there was only one certainty. The line between safety and savagery had never been thinner, and on that cold February morning, it had been obliterated. At 44, Thomas Graham was an experienced camper accustomed to nature's unpredictability. He enjoyed exploring Alaska's untamed wilderness. His dog, Buddy, a loyal golden retriever, had been his constant companion for years, joining him on countless expeditions into the wild. They shared an unbreakable bond, one built on trust and companionship. On June 6, 2023, that bond would be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The air was crisp that late afternoon. The towering trees swayed gently in the wind, and the fading light cast long shadows across the campsite. Graham had set up camp near a secluded river where he felt most at home. As the fire crackled, he leaned back in his chair, watching Buddy sniff around the perimeter, his tail wagging lazily. The stillness of the evening was deceptive, masking the lurking danger that was about to turn their trip into a nightmare. Without warning, a massive Kodiak bear emerged from the tree line, its hulking form moving with unsettling grace. Graham's heart pounded as he took in the beast's sheer size. Buddy's demeanor changed instantly. The retriever stiffened, his fur bristling, and a deep, warning growl rumbled from his throat. The bear hesitated momentarily before approaching, deciding the dog wasn't an impressive opponent. But Buddy kept barking, a sharp, desperate sound that shattered the quiet night. The sound angered the bear. Buddy leapt forward, his instinct driving him to protect his owner. The bear swiped a massive paw, sending the dog to the ground with a whimper. Graham shouted, rushing toward his injured companion, but the bear had already turned its attention toward him. The force of the animal's charge sent him tumbling backward, his body colliding with the hard earth. Before he could scramble away, the bear was on him. Graham had never felt pain like this before. The animal's weight was crushing. The man could almost feel his bones giving in under the pressure. Panic surged through him as he struggled against the predator's sheer power. He lashed out, fists pounding against thick fur, but the blows were pointless. The bear's claws raked across his shoulder. The pain was sharp. Breathing was becoming more and more difficult. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the dirt. He gasped for breath, his mind racing, searching for any possible escape. Before he could come up with anything, the bear bit down on his arm. The immense pressure caused the bones to crack beneath the bear's jaws this time. Graham screamed, the sound raw and filled with agony. He kicked, desperate to break free. Darkness threatened to consume him, his vision swimming to the edges of unconsciousness. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the bear lifted its head. Something had caught its attention. The sudden arrival of other campers had startled it. It released Graham and disappeared into the trees. Graham lay motionless, his body shattered, his breath ragged and uneven. Pain coursed through every nerve, but he was alive. Voices grew closer, urgent and panicked. Hands pressed against his wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. He could barely register the words around him, his consciousness slipping away. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, their helicopter slicing through the night sky. Graham was carefully lifted into the aircraft, his body barely clinging to life. The last thing he saw before everything faded was Buddy, injured but alive, his eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. The road to recovery was long and arduous. Multiple surgeries, endless hours of rehabilitation, and the lingering trauma of the attack haunted him. Buddy never left his side despite his injuries, a constant reminder of the fight they had survived together. The attack sent ripples through the community, reigniting conversations about the fragile balance between humans and wildlife. Some called for stricter regulations on camping in bear country, while others insisted that such encounters were simply a risk of venturing into the wild. For Graham, the debate was irrelevant. He had faced death and survived, but he had also learned a brutal truth. Nature was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. And out there, nothing could guarantee your survival. His scars would never fade, and neither would the memories. But as he looked at Buddy resting beside him, he knew one thing for certain. They had fought and survived, and that bond could never be broken. On July 14th, 2024, 5 officers were called to investigate reports of bear sightings near a remote campsite in the Wyoming backcountry. As they approached, they unknowingly cornered a young grizzly bear that had been separated from its mother. The frightened and disoriented bear charged toward the officers, desperately trying to escape. The officers reacted instantly, their training kicking in as they scrambled for their weapons and attempted to retreat. The bear was fast, faster than they had anticipated. One officer, Deputy Daryl Jensen, barely had time to raise his arm before the bear swiped at him, claws tearing through his uniform and slicing deep into his shoulder. He stumbled back, blood soaking his sleeve, his breath coming in ragged gasps as pain surged through his body. Sergeant Mike Halverson, the most experienced of the group, yelled for them to spread out, but the bear had already turned on Officer Daniel Ruiz. The young officer had tried to raise his rifle, but the sheer force of the grizzly's charge knocked him off his feet. The bear's massive paw came down on his chest, cracking ribs and forcing the air from his lungs. He gasped, unable to move as the bear's weight pinned him to the ground. The other officers scrambled, firing warning shots to drive the bear away. The sound echoed through the trees, but the panicked and aggressive bear showed no signs of backing down. It turned toward Officer Lisa Yang, who had managed to grab her bear spray. She deployed it desperately to stop the attack, the orange mist enveloping the bear's face. The animal roared in frustration, shaking its massive head and momentarily retreating, giving the officers a chance to act. Officer Jake Miller grabbed Ruiz by the collar, dragging him back while Halverson covered them. Despite the searing pain in his shoulder, Jensen reached his feet, adrenaline driving him forward. The bear, still disoriented from the spray, took a few steps back, but its fear and aggression kept it from fleeing. It reared onto its hind legs, towering over the officers, its massive form casting a shadow over them. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The officers braced themselves, knowing another attack could be fatal. Then, a loud crack echoed through the forest. A wildlife officer, responding to their distress call, fired a tranquilizer dart into the bear's side. The animal roared, staggering as the sedative took effect. It swayed on its feet before collapsing onto the ground, breathing heavily but slowly. The officers stood frozen, chests heaving, hands shaking as the reality of what had just happened set in. Backup arrived minutes later, and paramedics rushed to treat the injured officers. Jensen's shoulder wound required immediate attention. Ruiz was stabilized, despite his broken ribs, and the others nursed deep gashes and bruises. None of them had escaped unscathed, but they were alive. The bear, now unconscious, was carefully transported away from the area and relocated to a safer, uninhabited region far from human settlements. The attack served as a harsh reminder of the dangers lurking in the wilderness. It was a day for the officers they would never forget, when instinct, training, and sheer luck had kept them alive in the face of nature's raw power. In the aftermath of the attack, the department launched an internal review to evaluate its response. They had followed procedures, but the unpredictable nature of the wilderness had pushed them to their limits. Each officer faced a slow recovery, both physically and mentally. Jensen underwent surgery to repair the deep wounds on his shoulder, followed by weeks of physical therapy. Ruiz, struggling with the pain of his cracked ribs, found even simple movements agonizing. The others, though not as severely injured, bore scars that would remain with them for a lifetime. Media coverage of the attack renewed attention to the risks officers faced in remote areas. Wildlife experts debated whether the officers should have been better equipped, or if the incident was an unavoidable consequence of human-wildlife encounters. Upon recovery, the tranquilized bear was released into an isolated region, but concerns remained about increasing bear activity near human settlements. Each officer dealt with the trauma in their way. Halverson, who had always been steady under pressure, found himself replaying the attack in his mind, haunted by the moment the bear loomed over them. Despite her brave use of bear spray, Yang struggled with guilt, wondering if she could have acted faster. Miller, who had pulled Ruiz to safety, wrestled with the what-ifs. What if he had been slower? What if they hadn't been able to drive the bear away? As weeks passed, the officers reunited at the station, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. They spoke less of the attack itself and more of what came after, how each moment of pain, fear, and desperation had shaped them. They trained harder, drilled for every possible scenario, and determined that they would be even more prepared if they ever faced such a situation again. The scars remained, both visible and hidden. The memory of the bear, the weight of its presence, the raw fear of its charge, these would never fade. But neither would their survival, resilience, and determination to face whatever dangers lay ahead. They had come face to face with nature's fury and lived to tell the tale. 2025, John Harris spent a lifetime reading the wilderness, learning its signs, rhythms, and the unspoken language of the land. He had seen how winter gripped the Alaskan backcountry with an iron hand, how the wind carved ridges into the snow, and how the rivers lay silent beneath thick layers of ice, but never like this. In February, the national park in south-central Alaska was a vast and unforgiving frozen expanse of white silence. The park stretched millions of acres where the mountains swallowed sound and time felt meaningless. John had ventured here alone, as he had done many times before, trusting his instincts and years of experience. He had planned everything, his route, supplies, emergency beacons, but no plan could anticipate the wrong step, the unseen danger buried beneath the snow. His camp was in a small clearing near the base of a ridge, sheltered from the worst of the wind. He had built a fire pit, set up his tent, and stored his food away from camp, just as he always did. He had taken every precaution. After a quick meal, he strapped on his snowshoes and gathered more firewood that morning. Under the morning light, the land looked deceptively peaceful. The snow-covered ground stretched unbroken except for the skeletal remains of trees and the occasional rock outcrop. He moved methodically, his breath rising in white plumes, the axe's weight familiar in his gloved hands. He had done this 1,000 times before, but as he swung the axe against a thick fallen log, the ground beneath him gave a subtle tremor, something shifting deep below the snow. He felt it before he saw it, a deep vibration in the earth, something stirring where there should have been nothing. Then came the sound, a low, guttural exhalation, raw and ancient, carried on the cold air. The snow near a rocky overhang shifted and cracked, and something massive began to emerge from the darkness beneath it. The grizzly rose slowly, unsteady on its legs, fur matted with frost and dirt. Its eyes, small and sunken from months of hibernation, squinted against the daylight. John knew immediately what had happened. He had broken open a winter den and woken something that should not have been woken. His body reacted before his mind fully processed it. He took a step back, then another, hands trembling even as he kept his movements slow. The bear sniffed the air, its breath steaming in the cold, its body swaying slightly. It was confused, sluggish, not yet fully aware of what had roused it. But instinct ran deep in animals like this, and John knew hunger would soon override disorientation. He turned, moving carefully at first, then faster. But in his rush, he never saw the thin crust of ice hiding the drop beneath his feet. The snow collapsed, and before he could react, he was falling. He hit hard, his body tumbling down the narrow crevasse. The world spun, and then just as suddenly it stopped. His right leg had caught beneath a rock, wedging him in place. Pain shot through his body, sharp and immediate. He gasped, blinking up at the narrow slit of the sky above. For long minutes he fought to free himself, twisting, pulling, trying to shift the rock that pinned him. But the ice beneath his back was slick, and his strength meant nothing against the weight trapping his leg. The bear remained above. It had wandered forward, standing at the edge of the crevasse, peering down with dark, unreadable eyes. John barely dared to breathe, but the bear did not come for him. Instead, it turned away, shuffling off into the trees. Hours passed. He was no stranger to pain, but this was different. The cold was leaching into him now, creeping into his bones. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to think. His emergency beacon was in his pack, at camp, too far away to reach. He had his knife, but it was useless here. He tried again to free his leg, pushing, straining, his breaths coming ragged and fast, but the rock didn't budge. As the day faded into the evening, the temperature plummeted. His body ached from the cold, from exhaustion. He focused on breathing, on staying awake. But the cold had a way of dulling the senses, of making surrender seem easy. Then, sometime deep in the night, he heard it again. The low, rumbling exhale, the shuffle of heavy paws on snow. The bear had returned. It moved cautiously, as if uncertain. Its hunger had woken now, its instincts sharpening. It peered down into the crevasse, sniffing. Then, with terrifying ease, it began to climb down. John thrashed and fought, every nerve in his body screaming. He struck out, his hands clawing at the ice and walls. The bear's weight dislodged loose snow, sending small cascades onto him. It was too close. Its breath was hot and foul, its fur dusted with ice crystals. Then came the pull. Teeth clamped onto his coat, jerking him forward. His leg twisted, the pain unbearable, but the rock gave way. He was dragged back into the open air, out of the crevasse. He fought, kicked, and tried to free himself, but the bear's strength was beyond anything human resistance could match. The world became a blur of movement and pain. His body slammed against the snow, his vision flashing with the force of each impact. Claws raked over him, cutting through the fabric, through the skin. The bear's weight crushed him. Each breath a struggle against the press of muscle and fur. Pain lanced through his side, hot and immediate. He felt the wet warmth of blood, the sharp agony of tearing flesh. His body spasmed, his limbs moving without thought, without direction. But there was no escaping it. The bear was everywhere, its jaws, claws, the sheer weight of it. Somewhere in the chaos he felt himself weakening. The fight in him, so fierce at first, began to ebb. His body, broken and bloodied, no longer answered his will. The world blurred, the sky fading into nothing but a pale haze. And then there was nothing. Days later, the search team found what remained of him. Snow had begun to cover the ground where it had happened, but the signs were still there. The deep furrows in the earth, the scattered remains of gear, the unmistakable marks of a struggle. The bear was found nearby, still lingering in the area. Wildlife officials made the decision quickly. A grizzly that had tasted human blood could not be left to roam. The shot echoed through the trees, a single crack that shattered the silence. The wilderness had taken John Harris, as it had many before him. The search team carried his body, the weight of his final journey resting heavily on it. Soon the snow would come again, covering the last traces of what had happened. The mountains would remember, as they always did, but they would never tell. 2024, a zoo in San Diego was alive with the sounds of families, the chatter of children, and the occasional squawk of exotic birds. October had brought a crispness to the air, a slight chill that made the day comfortable beneath the golden California sun. Heather Davis strolled with her family, her camera swinging from its strap as she took in the sights. It had been years since she had visited a zoo, and the experience felt different now. Walking alongside her husband and children, watching them marvel at creatures they had only seen in books or on screens. Many loved the polar bear exhibit, a sprawling habitat designed to mimic the icy landscapes of the Arctic. It featured towering artificial rock formations, a large pool of clear blue water, and patches of faux snow. The bears, 2 adult males, were enormous, living testaments to the power and resilience of nature. Visitors often gathered along the thick glass barrier, pressing their hands against it, thrilled when the bears wandered close. Heather paused near the edge of the viewing platform, positioning herself for a photo. The ledge where she stood was slightly elevated, and many visitors leaned in for a better angle. The concrete surface was almost too smooth, and her shoe slipped when she shifted her weight to adjust her footing. It happened too fast for her to react. One moment she was steady, camera in hand. The next, gravity took hold. Her body pitched forward, her arms flailing desperately to catch herself. But there was nothing to grip, nothing to break the fall. She tumbled over the barrier, the world tilting as she plunged onto the rocky terrain of the enclosure. The impact sent a jolt through her body, pain flaring in her shoulder as she hit the ground hard. For a second she lay there, stunned, the breath knocked from her lungs. Then reality slammed into her with a force far worse than the fall. She was inside the enclosure. Above, voices erupted into panic, gasps, shouts, and people pointing. The world beyond the glass was a blur of movement, but everything was eerily still inside. The only sounds were the artificial stream's distant trickle and the water's rhythmic lapping against the rocks. And then, the bears noticed her from the far end of the habitat. The first one lifted its massive head, dark eyes locking onto her, and the second bear followed suit. They weren't rushing toward her, not yet, but they were moving, their enormous bodies shifting, muscles rippling beneath thick white fur. Heather scrambled to her knees, heart hammering. She had to get out, fast. The barrier was too high to climb, but the ledge she had fallen from wasn't far. If she could reach it, if she could just... A shadow passed over her. The first bear had closed the distance in a fraction of a second. It loomed above her, its sheer size impossible to comprehend up close. Although it had looked majestic on the viewing platform, almost slow in its movements, here, face to face, it was something else entirely. Ancient, built for survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The bear huffed, lowering its massive head, nostrils flaring again. It was curious, investigating. But curiosity about this powerful animal could turn lethal in an instant. Heather barely had time to react before the bear moved. A swipe, fast and effortless, knocked her backward. Pain exploded across her side as claws met flesh, tearing through fabric, leaving a searing burn in their wake. The force alone sent her sprawling onto the rocks, her limbs weak, struggling to respond. A thin crimson streak bloomed across her side, the wound deep but not enough to immobilize her. But the bear wasn't finished. It pressed forward, its bulk shifting, and a low, rumbling sound reverberated from its chest. Heather tried to crawl backward, pushing with her feet, but the terrain was uneven and jagged. Her hands scraped against the rough stone, and her fingers slipped as she fought to gain traction. The second bear was watching now, standing near the water's edge. It hadn't joined in yet, but its posture was alert, its focus sharp. Zoo staff rushed into action above. A loud alarm blared, sending animals retreating into their enclosures. Heather could hear voices shouting and sense movement beyond the glass, but she couldn't focus. The bear was too close. It reared up slightly, shifting its weight, assessing her. Heather's mind screamed at her to move, to get away, but her body wasn't cooperating fast enough. The bear's paw lifted again. Then, something changed. A loud, sharp, and piercing noise cut through the chaos. A shot was fired into the air, not to kill, but to deter. The bear flinched, its attention snapping upward. Another bang. This time it backed away, its muscles tensed and its eyes darted toward the source of the sound. It hesitated, considered, and finally took a step back. Heather didn't waste the chance. Hands shaking, she pushed herself upright, every inch of her body screaming in protest. Someone had lowered a rope into the enclosure, and arms were reaching for her, desperate to pull her out. She stumbled toward them, her legs unsteady. Just as she reached the edge, another shot rang out, this one closer. The bear jerked backward, its paws skidding slightly on the rocks. Heather felt hands grip her arms, hoisting her up and pulling her out of the nightmare. The moment she was back on the other side, her body gave out. She collapsed onto the ground, her breathing ragged, pain radiating through her side and shoulder. Blood soaked into her clothes, warm and sticky. Someone was pressing something against the wound, voices urgent, but she could barely register them. The bears remained in their enclosure, pacing now, the momentary confusion giving way to a return to their normal routine. They hadn't attacked out of malice. They had only responded to what their instincts dictated. The zoo had designed their home to be as close to the Arctic wild as possible, and in that moment, they had simply behaved as they would in the wild. Heather was rushed to the hospital, her body battered but alive. The wounds on her side were deep, requiring multiple surgeries, but she had survived. News of the attack spread quickly, headlines capturing the moment's horror. Experts weighed in, discussing the unpredictable nature of wild animals, even in captivity. The zoo reinforced the viewing area, making changes to prevent future incidents. But the polar bears remained untouched by the chaos they had caused, continuing their lives as they always had, unaware of the fragile human world beyond the glass. 2024, the August air on Kodiak Island carried the scent of damp earth, mixing with the musk of spruce trees and the lingering chill of the northern Pacific. The coastline stretched endlessly, waves crashing against jagged rocks in a rhythm as old as the land itself. Thomas Reed moved steadily along a narrow trail, his boots pressing into the damp soil, each step measured against the uneven terrain. His brother walked a few paces behind, their conversation light. The silence of the wilderness wrapped around them like a thick blanket. The remoteness of the place was striking. There was no hum of distant roads, no signs of civilization, just the wind and the slow creak of tree limbs shifting in the breeze. They had been hiking for hours, following a well-worn path that hugged the coastline, occasionally opening up to breathtaking water views. A bald eagle had soared overhead earlier. Its wings spread wide as it rode the currents, scanning for fish below. It was easy to forget in moments like these how unforgiving the wild could be. The brothers were cautious, aware of where they were. Kodiak bears roamed these forests, their immense size making them the undisputed rulers of the island. They had read the warnings and seen the signs, and it was advice they took seriously. But after miles of empty trails and nothing but the occasional rustling of unseen animals, the anxiety had faded into the background. They didn't hear it at first. The sound was subtle, just the faintest shift of movement through the dense underbrush. A twig snapped, then another, but the wind carried the noise away before their minds could fully register it. 100 small sounds filled the forest at any moment, branches swaying, squirrels darting through the leaves, the distant rush of water. It was easy to dismiss. Then Thomas felt it. There was a deep instinctual awareness of being watched. There was a slow, creeping pressure as if the air had thickened around him. He stopped walking, his body suddenly rigid, every nerve on edge. His brother halted behind him, sensing the change in his posture. A massive and silent Kodiak bear emerged from the brush like a ghost. Its fur was the color of damp earth. Muscles rippled beneath its thick coat, and its sheer size was a breathtaking display of power. The bear wasn't charging or growling, it was just watching, assessing. For a moment neither man moved. The bear's dark eyes locked onto them, its head swaying slightly as it took in their presence. It had likely caught their scent long before they noticed it, drawn in by curiosity rather than aggression. But curiosity in a creature this large could turn dangerous instantly. Thomas knew what he needed to do. Slow movements, no sudden gestures, back away, give it space. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he kept breathing even, his muscles tight with controlled tension. Then his foot slipped. The rock beneath him shifted unexpectedly, sending his weight forward. His ankle twisted sharply, and he collapsed onto one knee before he could correct himself. The sudden motion shattered the fragile balance of the moment. The bear tensed, and its ears flattened, and then it charged. The speed was shocking. One moment it was still, the next it was closing the distance with terrifying force. Thomas barely had time to react before the impact knocked him flat. A massive paw swiped across his leg, shooting searing pain through him as claws tore through fabric and flesh alike. The force of the blow sent him rolling across the ground, his body slamming against the roots of a nearby tree. His mind blurred with the shock of it, but instinct kept him moving. He twisted, trying to push himself up, but the pain in his leg sent a brutal jolt through his body. The bear loomed over him, towering like something out of a nightmare, its breath heavy and thick with the scent of wet fur and raw earth. His brother was already moving. A thick branch lay nearby, half buried in the undergrowth, and he grabbed it, his body coiled with desperation. The bear focused on Thomas, its weight shifting as it prepared to strike again. Then the stick came down hard, slamming against its shoulder with a dull thud. It wasn't a fatal blow, not even close, but it was enough. The bear flinched, a deep huff escaping its throat as it approached the new threat. The stick came down again, waving aggressively, the space between them and the bear widening slightly. The animal hesitated, its mind warring between instinct and uncertainty. Then it backed off, not in fear or defeat, but in quiet calculation. It huffed once more, its massive chest rising and falling, then turned, melting back into the underbrush with the same eerie silence with which it had appeared. The brothers didn't move for several long moments. The only sound was the distant crash of waves, the wind filtering through the trees. The world had continued, indifferent to the violence that had just unfolded. Thomas gritted his teeth as he shifted, the wound in his leg burning, blood soaking through his pants. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but bad enough. His brother was already moving toward him, steadying him as he pushed himself upright. They needed to move. The nearest cabin wasn't far, an old ranger shelter, abandoned for most of the year but still stocked with emergency supplies. Thomas gritted his teeth as he forced himself forward, his weight unsteady, his muscles screaming with each step. His brother supported him, half carrying him over the uneven terrain. By the time they reached the shelter, the pain had settled into a dull, persistent throb, his body exhausted from the adrenaline crash. The cabin was simple, 4 walls, a roof, nothing more, but it was shelter. His brother dug through the emergency supplies, finding bandages, gauze, and anything to stop the bleeding. As Thomas sat there, his breathing slowing and his body aching, the reality of what had happened settled over him. It had been avoidable. With a few more precautions, more noise, more awareness, the encounter might never have escalated. But that was the nature of the wild. It did not follow human rules and did not yield to expectations. It simply existed, vast and untamed, indifferent to the presence of those who wandered too close. By morning, his leg would still ache, and his body would still bear the marks of the encounter. But the island would go on, untouched by their moment of fear. Somewhere, deep in the forest, the bear would move along its path as it always had. And in the end, the wilderness would remember nothing, but they would remember everything. The early morning stillness in Libby's small train station was broken only by the occasional hum of fluorescent lights. It was February 2025, and a thin layer of frost clung to the windows, the cold outside sharp enough to make breath fog in thick clouds. Inside, travelers stood in loose clusters, shifting on their feet, hands tucked into coats, waiting for the day's first train while sipping bad coffee and eating sandwiches from the vending machines. 34-year-old Emily Harris adjusted her scarf while holding her daughter Lily's small hand. The 6-year-old, bundled in a pink puffer jacket, yawned and rubbed her sleepy eyes. Emily had promised her daughter an adventure, a train ride to visit her grandparents across the state. She had checked their tickets 3 times, keeping them tucked in her coat pocket. Lily hummed quietly, swinging her legs as they waited, oblivious to the growing danger outside. Something stirred in the darkness beyond the station doors. It was a bear, a grizzly, as lean as it was massive. An incomplete hibernation had made it hungry and mad. The bear padded slowly across the icy pavement, its breath rising in thick clouds, the scents drifting from the station. Food, warmth, life drew it forward. It moved toward the entrance with no hesitation. Inside, the automatic doors slid open with a quiet hiss. A gust of cold air swept into the station as the bear entered. At first, no one reacted. A few people glanced up, expecting a late commuter rushing in from the cold. But heads turned when the heavy, deliberate footfalls echoed across the tile floor. Conversations faltered. The realization spread like a slow-moving shockwave. Emily turned at the sound of gasps and sharp cries. Her stomach lurched. The bear stood just beyond the entrance, its hulking frame blocking the exit. It lifted its massive head, nostrils flaring as it took in the scent of fresh food and terrified humans. The room held its breath. Then the bear stepped further inside the room, and mayhem ensued. Emily shoved Lily behind her as the beast barreled forward, knocking aside a row of chairs as easily as if they were toys. The impact came too fast to react. A wall of muscle and fur slammed into Emily. The force knocked the air from her lungs, her head snapping back against the hard tile. The bear's claws were everywhere, raking across her side, back, and legs. Lily briefly got caught in the attack. Before her mother pushed her away and screamed at her to get away, the bear's claws connected with her small shoulder, slicing it open. At her mother's command, Lily scrambled away. The girl's scream pierced the air as she watched her mother being mauled. Dazed, Emily tried to move and reassure her daughter, but the bear's weight pinned her down. Hot breath blasted against her face as the beast loomed over her. A flash of yellowed teeth made her blood turn icy in her veins, and then, as the bear let out a deep, agonizing roar, Emily realized she was going to die, and her beloved daughter was going to see everything. Claws tore into Emily's chest, slicing through flesh and leaving deep, gaping wounds. Jaws snapped down onto her shoulder, crushing bone with horrifying ease. Blood pooled beneath her, soaking into the tile, steaming against the cold air. She gasped, a ragged, broken sound, but her only thought was of Lily. The child was frozen, eyes wide with horror, her tiny hands clutched at the hem of her jacket. Tears streamed down her face, but she couldn't move. Around them, commuters bolted for cover, some diving behind benches, others sprinting toward the far end of the station, hoping to find safety. The ticket clerk had vanished, leaving the counter abandoned. The bear, consumed by instinct, paid no attention to anything else. Then a backpack flew through the air, striking the bear's head. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The animal flinched, momentarily distracted. Lily's cries filled the air as a pair of hands grabbed her, pulling her away. A man, face pale with fear, scooped her up and stumbled backward, shielding her with his body as he rushed toward the others. The bear shook itself, nostrils flaring, blood staining its muzzle. It looked up, its black eyes sweeping across the station. And then, gunfire rang out. The first shot hit the tiled floor, sending shards of ceramic flying and making commuters scream again. The second struck the bear's shoulder, a burst of red against thick fur. It let out a roar, rearing up on its hind legs, its massive form towering over the station's cowering travelers. Another shot rang out, and then another. The bear jerked back. Its breaths came in heavy, ragged gasps. The pain, the confusion, the loud noises, it was too much. It turned, staggering, before lurching back toward the entrance. The automatic doors opened again, and the beast stumbled into the cold, vanishing into the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the station, the silence was suffocating. Emily lay motionless in a growing pool of crimson. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, her fingers twitching weakly. She tried to focus, tried to see past the blinding pain. She saw Lily. The girl's shoulder was bleeding, but she was safe. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she had no strength to speak. Then, she went still. By the time paramedics arrived, the floor was slick with blood, and the station reeked of fear. Lily clung to the man who had saved her. Her small hands balled into fists against his coat, oblivious to her physical pain. Her eyes were wide with shock, glued to her mother's lifeless body. Later, they found the bear's body deep in the trees, its wounds fatal. Officials determined it had been starving, its hibernation cycle disrupted. But those facts didn't matter to Lily. She would remember only the cold tile, the roar of the beast, and the sight of her mother's body broken beneath its claws. She would remember the moment the world changed forever. The morning that had begun with excitement and ended in terror. There would be no forgetting for Lily. It was a stormy night in July 2024. The air was thick with the scent of rain and damp earth, the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the vast, untamed wilderness of a national park in south-central Alaska. The storm had built slowly throughout the evening, dark clouds gathering over the jagged peaks, smothering the last traces of daylight. Jessica Ward, a seasoned solo camper at 36, had known the weather could turn violent. Still, she had set up her camp carefully, confident in her ability to endure whatever nature threw at her. Her tent, tucked into a small clearing between towering spruce trees, had held against the wind for most of the night. The rain hammered the fabric in steady sheets, pooling in the creases. The wind howled through the trees, shaking branches and tearing through the undergrowth. The temperature had dropped. Without warning, the gusts strengthened, a sudden burst of force ripping through the clearing. The thin aluminum poles buckled. The tent's fabric caved inward, pressing against Jessica's body before snapping loose. The tent crumpled around her, the walls collapsing, trapping her in tangled nylon. Jessica fought to push herself free, cursing under her breath as the wind clawed at her exposed skin. Cold raindrops struck her face, soaking through her jacket. She needed to reset the stakes, reinforce the poles, and ride out the storm. But she sensed a heavy presence when she stepped into the open. Her pulse spiked. The storm had masked the sound of its approach, but now she saw it. Broad shoulders, dark fur matted with rain, eyes reflecting dull light. A grizzly bear, massive and close, its breath visible in the cold air. Neither of them moved, Jessica because she was terrified, the bear because it was sizing her up. Suddenly, the bear decided she wasn't much of a threat. It charged. The sheer force of the impact slammed into Jessica's chest, knocking her off her feet. Her body hit the wet ground hard, the breath forced from her lungs in a single, painful gasp. Clawed paws pressed down on her ribs, pinning her as the bear's weight crushed against her. The musky stench of wet fur filled her nostrils, mingling with the metallic scent of her blood as the first searing pain erupted from her shoulder. The bear's teeth sank deep, puncturing her flesh and ripping through her muscles. The woman screamed, her body convulsing under the agony, but the wind and rain drowned the sound. The bear's jaws clamped harder, shaking her. But Jessica was a fighter. Her survival instincts kicked in. Trembling and slick with rain, her hand fumbled at her belt, searching for the bear spray. The small canister, Her last defense was still there. She forced her shaking fingers to grip it, wrenching it free, angling it blindly toward the bear's face. She pressed the trigger. The chemical spray erupted in a sharp burst, misting into the storm. The bear recoiled, releasing her, its massive head jerking back as it inhaled the burning cloud. It shook its head violently. Jessica didn't hesitate. She rolled onto her side, dragging herself through the mud, despite her body screaming in protest. Blood poured from her shoulder, soaking into her clothes, and her left arm was nearly useless. The pain was excruciating, but she had no time to acknowledge it. She needed distance. Through the haze of rain and her blurred vision, she saw the animal recover. It huffed, claws raking the earth, rage overriding discomfort. It lunged again. She tried to crawl faster, her legs slipping in the mud. The bear swiped, claws raking her calf, tearing fabric, flesh. She collapsed, her face hitting the wet ground, pain radiating through her entire body. She was losing. Suddenly, the bear's head snapped up, ears swiveling. Jessica didn't wait to see what had drawn its attention. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she clawed forward, dragging herself toward the only thing that might save her, her bear-proof food container. It was bolted to the ground, reinforced steel, and there was a small gap between it and the nearest tree. It wasn't a shelter, but maybe it would become a barrier. Each movement sent fire through her wounds. Blood loss made her dizzy, the world tilting violently as she forced herself forward, inch by inch. Her fingers slipped against the cold metal, her breath ragged and uneven. The bear turned back toward her, hesitating for only a second before charging again. Jessica threw herself behind the container, pressing against the hard steel, making herself small, invisible. The bear reached her in seconds, its massive body colliding with the container's side. It sniffed, its claws scraping the surface. She held her breath. The bear paced, circling, its frustration evident in every heavy step. It growled low, guttural, the sound vibrating in her bones. Her head swam, exhaustion pressing in, threatening to pull her under. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the bear stopped. Then, with one final huff, it turned and disappeared into the forest. Jessica didn't move. She couldn't. Her body was broken and her vision was dimming. She fought against the pull of shock, struggling to stay conscious. She didn't know how much time had passed before she heard real and human footsteps. She was lifted, carried, her body weightless in their grasp. Pain threatened to consume her, but she clung to one thought. She was alive. They found her tent shredded, and blood covered the ground where she had fallen. The storm had masked everything. The sounds, the warnings, the moment the bear first entered the clearing. Later, experts would say the bear was starving. The berry crop had failed, leaving it desperate and aggressive. They would say the storm had disoriented it, sending it stumbling into her camp. Jessica knew only that she had come face to face with raw, untamed power, with something stronger, faster, and relentless. She had fought and survived, but she would never forget the feeling of those jaws closing around her body, the weight of something that didn't see her as a person, but only as prey. The lingering bite of winter was in the morning air on March 12th, 2024. The ground was still crusted with frost despite the creeping signs of spring. Henry Miller had spent his entire life working this land, rising before dawn each day to tend to his cattle, his body long accustomed to the demands of farm life. At 57, his hands were rough with years of labor, his back slightly stooped from countless hours spent hauling feed and repairing fences. The land stretched wide and unforgiving around him, the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow. It was a harsh place, but it was the only home he had ever known. Henry moved efficiently, loading fresh hay into the troughs, the rhythmic clatter of feed filling the quiet of the early morning. The cows stirred sluggishly, their breath visible in the cold air as they nudged closer, their heavy bodies shifting lazily. Henry had just begun securing the barn doors when something made him pause. A strange stillness had settled over the land, an unnatural silence that sent an uneasy ripple through his gut. Not long after, he saw a grizzly bear emerging from the tree line at the edge of his property. Henry had encountered bears before, had seen them prowling the distant ridges or scavenging along the riverbanks. Still, they never strayed this close. Not this early in the season, not with this deliberate, unsettling boldness. Something was wrong. The bear moved slowly at first, its thick fur matted, its ribs faintly visible beneath its hide. Its breath came in heavy puffs as it sniffed the air, its black eyes locking onto Henry with a hunger that made his stomach tighten. It should have turned away and been deterred by the sight of a human, but it kept coming, its massive paws pressing into the frozen earth. Henry knew better than to run, knew that sudden movement could trigger a chase, but he also knew he couldn't stand there and wait for the inevitable. He needed to secure the animals before the bear decided to close the distance. He took a careful step back, trying to appear unthreatening, But the second he moved, the bear reacted. Without warning, it surged forward. Henry tried to turn, but before he knew it, the animal was on him, knocking him off his feet with a force that sent him sprawling into the dirt. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, his vision blurring as he scrambled to push himself up. But the bear was already there, looming over him, its massive claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. The first blow struck his shoulder, searing pain ripping through him as his coat shredded beneath the force of the claws. The second came a heartbeat later, a brutal swipe across his chest that sent blood spraying across the frozen ground. Henry gasped, his body screaming in agony. But survival instincts kicked in, forcing him to fight through the pain. He twisted, kicking out mindlessly, his boot connecting with the bear's snout, which only enraged the animal further. The bear reared up, its teeth flashing as it lunged again. Henry raised his arms in a desperate attempt to shield himself, but the bear's jaws closed around his forearm, crushing bone with terrifying ease. A scream tore from his throat, echoing across the land, but he wasn't sure there was anyone close enough to hear. Blood soaked his clothes, hot and sticky, his vision darkening at the edges as the bear tore at him, its claws raking across his ribs, its weight pressing him into the earth. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, his strength fading with every passing second. Somewhere in the haze of pain, he became dimly aware of voices, shouts carried by the wind, distant but growing closer. The bear heard the sounds too, and it took a step back. The brief pause allowed Henry to drag himself toward the barn, but his body refused to obey. He was too weak, too broken. The bear turned toward the approaching sounds, its posture shifting, muscles tensing as if weighing the threat. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, it spun and bolted, disappearing into the trees with the same unnatural speed it had arrived with. Henry lay motionless, his breath shallow, his body trembling as he stared at the sky, the world tilting and fading around him. By the time the workers reached him, he was barely clinging to consciousness. Rough hands lifted him, voices urgent, panicked, calling his name, but he could barely respond. The pain was everywhere, drowning him, pulling him under. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the sound of the hollow and endless wind sweeping across the land. The hospital was nearly an hour away, and though the paramedics fought to keep him stable, his injuries were too severe. His body had endured too much blood lost, too much damage inflicted by claws and teeth meant to tear through flesh with merciless efficiency. By the time the helicopter touched down, Henry Miller was gone. News of his death spread quickly through the small Wyoming town, sending shockwaves through the community. People spoke of the attack in uneasy tones, struggling to reconcile the brutal reality of what had happened with the quiet, dependable man they had known. The land he had worked his entire life, the land he had loved, had become where he met his end. Wildlife officials tracked the bear the following days, scouring the dense forests and rugged terrain for any sign of the rogue predator. When they finally located it, miles from Henry's farm, it was emaciated, its body worn thin from the harsh winter, and its desperation turning it into a killer. It had no choice. Hunger had driven it past the point of fear, the boundaries of instinct, and the invisible line that had once separated the wild from the world of men. The bear was put down, its body taken for study, its death bringing a cold, hollow kind of closure. But for those who had known Henry Miller, it changed nothing. His absence was a wound that would never truly heal, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the land they called home. In June 2024, Frank and his 14-year-old son Mason camped in a national park in the northwestern region of Wyoming. Dense forests and towering mountains surrounded them, creating a peaceful setting. Frank had always loved the outdoors and wanted to share that passion with Mason. It was their first camping trip alone together. He had taught his son how to build a fire, cook over an open flame, and stay safe in the wild. Mason was excited but a little nervous. He had read about bear attacks before, but his father assured him they had taken all necessary precautions. Their food was stored in a bear-proof container, and they had bear spray with them. As the sun set, they sat by the fire, discussing their plans for the next day. Mason wanted to go fishing at a nearby river, and Frank promised they would wake up early to do just that. That night, the forest was quiet. The stars shone brightly above them, and a cool breeze rustled the trees. But deep in the woods, a hungry grizzly bear was wandering. The bear had been struggling to find food, and the scent of their campfire and stored food led it straight to their tent. Just before dawn, Frank stirred in his sleeping bag, sensing movement outside. A heavy sound, like deep breathing, came from near their supplies, and his heart began to pound. He unzipped the tent slowly and peeked outside. The massive grizzly stood only a few feet away, sniffing the air. Its dark eyes locked onto him, and he knew they were in danger at that moment. Thinking quickly, Frank grabbed a flashlight and banged on a metal cup. trying to scare it away. The bear hesitated, then took a step closer. Desperate, he threw a rock, hitting its shoulder. That was a mistake. The grizzly growled and lunged forward, charging straight at him. Frank was knocked to the ground as the bear swiped at him with its powerful claws, tearing through his jacket and cutting into his skin. Pain shot through his body as he struggled beneath the weight of the massive animal. Mason woke up to the noise and saw his father working. Without thinking, he rushed forward, trying to pull the bear away, but the bear turned its attention to him. Mason screamed as the bear knocked him down, its sharp claws cutting into his back. The grizzly bit down, shaking him violently. Frank forced himself up despite his injuries, reaching for anything he could use. His fingers closed around his hunting knife. He plunged the blade into the bear's side with all his strength. The bear roared in pain, releasing Mason and stumbling back. Frank stabbed it again, forcing it to retreat. Bleeding, the bear finally turned and ran into the woods. Frank crawled to his son, holding him close. Mason's breathing was weak, his face pale from blood loss. He whispered something, then went still in his father's arms. Frank held his son close, his hands shaking. The cold morning air surrounded him, but he barely noticed. Mason lay lifeless in his arms, his body still and covered in deep wounds. Frank whispered his son's name, hoping for a response, but there was none. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. Pain shot through Frank's body as he tried to move. His arms and back were covered in gashes, and his clothes were soaked in blood. His vision blurred, but he knew he had to get help. He reached for his phone, his fingers numb and weak. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. With shaking hands, he dialed for emergency assistance. His voice was hoarse as he gave their location. The dispatcher told him to stay awake and keep pressure on his wounds until help arrived. Time passed slowly as he sat there, holding Mason. The forest was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Frank's thoughts raced. He had planned this trip to create memories with his son, but now he was leaving with unbearable loss. He blamed himself for not doing more to protect Mason. After what felt like forever, approaching footsteps broke the silence. Park rangers and paramedics arrived, their flashlights cutting through the dim light of morning. They rushed to Frank's side, assessing his injuries. When they saw Mason, their expressions darkened. They confirmed what Frank already knew. Mason had not survived. The medics helped Frank onto a stretcher, carefully bandaging his wounds. He barely noticed as they carried him away from the campsite. His mind was stuck on the moment when Mason had taken his last breath. The helicopter arrived shortly after, taking him to the nearest hospital. The journey was a blur. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to treat Frank's injuries. His wounds were deep, but he would survive. The physical pain was nothing compared to the grief that filled him. He stared at the ceiling, feeling numb. The weight of what had happened crushed him. News of the attack spread quickly. Wildlife officials tracked down the grizzly responsible for the attack. They found it deep in the woods, weakened from its wounds. To prevent further danger, the grizzly was put down. Some people agreed with the decision, while others believed it was following its instincts. Mason's death shook the community. Friends and family gathered to support Frank, but nothing could take away his sorrow. The funeral was quiet, with loved ones remembering Mason's kindness and adventurous spirit. Frank sat in silence, unable to believe his son was gone. Days turned into weeks, but the pain did not fade. Frank struggled with guilt, replaying the events in his mind. He knew he had done everything possible, but it did not feel like enough. The scars on his body would heal, but the loss of Mason would stay with him forever. In August 2024, Jake and his 16-year-old daughter, Sophie, set out on a horseback trip through the Teton Wilderness in Wyoming. Jake had spent most of his life around horses, working as a guide for tourists and hunters. He knew these lands well and dreamed of sharing his love for the wild with his daughter. Sophie had grown up hearing stories of her father's adventures and had finally convinced him to take her on a long ride deep into the wilderness. The trip was supposed to be a peaceful journey, a chance to bond while exploring the beauty of nature. The morning air was crisp as they rode along a narrow trail surrounded by towering pine trees. Their horses moved steadily over rocky terrain, the rhythmic sound of hooves echoing in the quiet forest. Jake led the way, keeping an eye out for signs of wildlife. Sophie followed closely behind, her excitement clear as she took the breathtaking views. They had already spotted a herd of elk grazing in the distance and a bald eagle soaring high above. Everything felt calm, just as Jake had hoped. The atmosphere suddenly changed as they entered a dense part of the forest. The horses became uneasy, their ears twitching and their movements hesitant. Jake recognized the signs immediately. Something was nearby. something that made the animals nervous. Before he could react, a massive grizzly bear charged out of the thick brush, roaring as it sprinted toward them. The bear crashed into Jake's horse, knocking the animal to the ground. Jake was thrown violently from the saddle, landing hard on the rocky dirt. Pain shot through his body as he struggled to sit up, his heart pounding. Sophie gasped as her horse reared up, nearly throwing her off. She gripped the reins tightly, trying to stay in control, but the bear's attention quickly turned to her. The grizzly lunged at Sophie's horse, its powerful claws slashing at the terrified animal. The horse let out a painful scream as deep gashes tore through its flesh. Sophie clung to the saddle, her fear rising as the animal beneath her struggled to escape. Jake knew he had to act fast. Ignoring the pain in his body, he reached for the rifle strapped to his saddle. His hands shook as he lifted it, aiming at the massive predator. He fired once, then again. The bullet struck the bear, but it barely flinched. It turned its massive head toward Jake, its dark eyes filled with rage. Jake fired again, his mind racing as he realized how little time they had. He fired several more shots, his ears ringing from the sound. Finally, the bear hesitated, backing away slightly. It let out a low growl before retreating into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Jake collapsed to the ground, his body aching from the fall. Blood dripped from his injuries, his breath coming in short gasps. Sophie slid off her horse, her hands shaking as she rushed to her father's side. They had survived, but the terror of the attack had changed them forever. Jake lay on the ground, trying to catch his breath. His body ached from the hard fall, and his clothes were torn and covered in dirt. He could feel sharp pain in his ribs and shoulder, but he forced himself to focus. Sophie knelt beside him, her face pale as she looked at the injuries on his arm and leg. Blood seeped from deep scratches where the bear's claws had torn through his skin. His breathing was heavy, but he knew they had to move before the bear returned. Sophie's horse stood nearby, trembling with fear. Its side was covered in deep wounds where the grizzly's claws had struck. Jake struggled to his feet, pain shooting through his body with every movement. He placed a hand on the horse, feeling its heavy breathing. The animal was still standing, but it was weak from the attack. Jake knew they had to get help as soon as possible. Jake turned to his horse, which had gotten up after the attack. The animal limped, shaken but still able to walk. He reached for his saddlebag and pulled a cloth, pressing it against his wounds. Sophie helped him onto his horse, her hands shaking as she held her injured animal's reins. They had to get back to camp before nightfall. The ride back was slow and painful. Jake winced with every movement, and Sophie kept looking over her shoulder, afraid the grizzly would return. The forest felt different now, no longer peaceful, but filled with danger. Every rustling leaf and distant sound made them nervous. The only goal was to get to safety before darkness made it impossible to see. After hours, they reached the trail leading to their camp. The sight of their tents brought relief, but the fear of the attack still clung to them. Jake slid off his horse, barely able to stand. Sophie quickly helped him to the ground, doing her best to keep him steady. His leg was swollen, and blood still seeped through his torn clothes. Sophie grabbed the emergency radio from their supplies, her hands fumbling with the buttons as she called for help. The signal was weak, but she reached someone after several tries. She explained what had happened, her voice shaking as she spoke. The response came quickly. Help was on the way. As they waited, Jake leaned against a tree, his body exhausted. Sophie sat beside him, her face still pale. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the camp. The silence between them was heavy. The attack had changed everything. The wilderness no longer felt safe. When the rescue team arrived, they quickly assessed Jake's wounds and checked on Sophie's injured horse. Jake was taken away for medical treatment, and the horse was carefully returned to safety. The attack would leave scars, both on their bodies and in their minds. The land they had once loved now carried the memory of fear. In October 2023, the cold winds of the Kodiak Islands swept through the dense forests. Eric Hall was an experienced hunter who had spent years tracking animals in the wild. He knew the dangers of hunting in remote areas, but his love for the outdoors always brought him back. Born and raised in Alaska, he had grown up learning survival skills from his father. Hunting was more than just a pastime for him. It was a way of life. On this particular day, Eric set out early in the morning carrying his rifle and gear. He had planned to hunt deer but knew the area was home to much larger animals. Kodiak bears, The largest brown bears in the world roamed these forests. He had encountered them before, but had always managed to keep a safe distance. This time, things would be different. As the sun set, Eric climbed into a tree stand, hoping to spot a target before returning to camp. A rustling sound in the distance broke the stillness of the forest. He focused his eyes and saw a massive Kodiak bear moving through the trees. Its thick fur glowed under the fading sunlight, and its powerful frame sent a chill down his spine. Eric carefully lifted his rifle, steadying his breath. He knew that he had to make the shot count if he fired. His finger pressed against the trigger, and the sound of the gunshot echoed through the forest. The bullet missed its mark, and in an instant, the bear's behavior changed. Its ears flattened, and its deep, rumbling growl filled the air. The missed shot had turned the hunter into prey. The bear charged incredibly fast, covering the distance between them in seconds. Eric tried to reload, but there was no time. The bear reached the tree's base and lunged, shaking the stand violently. Eric lost his balance and fell, landing hard on the forest floor. Before he could react, the bear swiped at his chest, its sharp claws tearing through his jacket and cutting into his skin. Pain shot through his body, but he knew he had to fight. He scrambled backward, reaching for his rifle, but the bear was faster. Its massive paw pinned him down, and its powerful jaws clamped onto his leg, sending another wave of pain through him. His vision blurred, and his breaths came in short gasps. Desperate to survive, Eric grasped the ground, searching for anything he could use. His fingers closed around a sharp stick, which he drove into the bear's eye with every ounce of strength. The animal let out a deep roar, momentarily stunned. It shook its head wildly, then turned and retreated into the forest. Eric was left alone, severely injured and struggling to breathe. He knew he had to get to safety before he lost too much blood. He crawled toward his camp with no other choice, hoping to make it before it was too late. Eric's body ached with every movement as he dragged himself through the forest. The deep wounds on his chest burned with each breath, and his injured leg throbbed with unbearable pain. Blood soaked his torn clothing, leaving a trail behind him as he struggled to move forward. The cold wind cut through the trees, making his body tremble. He knew he might not have survived the night if he had stopped now. The journey back to his camp felt endless. Every few feet he had to pause to catch his breath. His arms grew weaker, and his vision blurred. He tried to listen for any sounds, fearing the wounded bear might return. The forest was silent except for the rustling leaves and his heavy breathing. The night was closing in, and darkness made everything around him harder to see. After hours, he finally spotted the small clearing where his camp was set up. Relief washed over him, but his strength was nearly gone. He pulled himself toward his tent with the last bit of energy left. His supplies were just a few feet away, but his body refused to move any further. His hands shook as he reached for his emergency satellite phone. The next thing he remembered was the distant sound of an approaching helicopter. The rescue team had received his distress signal and were searching for him. Bright lights shone through the darkness, and voices called out his name. He tried to respond, but his voice was weak. Moments later, strong hands lifted him onto a stretcher. He felt the warmth of blankets around him, but the pain in his body was overwhelming. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to treat his injuries. Deep claw marks covered his chest, and his leg had severe bite wounds. The medical team cleaned and stitched the cuts while giving him fluids to regain strength. Days passed before he was stable enough to talk about what had happened. The attack had left both physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. News of the incident spread quickly. Other hunters and locals in the Kodiak Islands were reminded of the dangers of entering the wilderness. Many who had known Eric were shocked that an experienced hunter like him had come so close to losing his life. Experts studied the attack and warned others about the unpredictable nature of these large predators. For Eric, the experience was nothing short of life-altering. He had spent years navigating the wild, finding solace in its untamed beauty. But now, the thought of returning filled him with an unsettling dread. The image of the bear, its sheer power, the primal force behind its charge, was seared into his mind, playing repeatedly like a nightmare that refused to fade. Even in sleep, he couldn't escape it. He knew he was lucky. Miraculously, he had survived, but the razor-thin margin between life and death was something he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a close call, but a moment that redefined his relationship with the wilderness. Once a source of comfort, the towering trees now felt like looming sentinels, whispering reminders of what had nearly happened. The forest, which had always been his refuge, would never feel the same again. Kyle Davis had always thrived on adventure, building his successful YouTube channel around daring solo expeditions into the wild. His subscribers loved his mix of confidence, charisma, and ability to turn every trip into a gripping survival story. At 27, he had spent years honing his outdoor skills and entertaining his audience with almost unimaginable adventures, some more authentic than others. But on May 19, 2024, Kyle would experience his greatest challenge yet. That morning, Kyle had set out on a trail deep within the Smoky Mountains, eager to capture footage for his latest video. The forest was alive with birdsong, the dense canopy above filtering soft rays of sunlight onto the path. He moved carefully, his camera rolling, narrating each step with practiced ease. His audience loved his personality, the almost unfiltered stream of his thoughts, and he prided himself on delivering just that. He had packed light, only essentials. His bear spray hung from his belt, a tool he had never needed. He trekked through the wilderness for hours, pausing now and then to explain foraging techniques, demonstrate water purification, and discuss navigation skills. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed fresh claw marks on a nearby tree, deep grooves cutting through the bark, a sign of a black bear. He knew the creatures roamed these mountains but had never encountered one up close. His pulse quickened, excitement flickering in his chest. This was exactly the kind of footage his viewers would love. Kyle adjusted his camera, moving cautiously toward the marks and scanning the surroundings. Soon after, he saw the animal, a black bear, roughly 100 feet ahead, sniffing the air, its powerful body shifting with each slow step. He had seen bears before, but always at a distance and with a clear escape route. Now, standing in the undergrowth, he had a decision to make. His instincts told him to back away, but his content-driven mind urged him forward. Carefully, he adjusted his zoom, steadying his hands as he focused on the bear. It hadn't noticed him yet, its attention fixed on something in the distance. He crept forward, hoping for a closer shot. The wind shifted. The bear lifted its head. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. If anything, the bear seemed curious. Kyle dared to take a step forward, and with that small step, the bear's curiosity turned into something far more dangerous. The animal huffed, nostrils flaring, its muscles tensed. Kyle had seen enough documentaries to recognize the warning. He knew better than to run. Instead, he slowly stepped back, trying to create distance. But the bear wasn't retreating. It advanced, ears flattened, eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a spike of fear through his gut. He reached for his bear spray, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Too slow. Before he knew it, the bear charged. The impact sent Kyle sprawling backward. His camera tumbled from his hands, landing in the dirt, still recording. The bear's claws raked across his chest, slicing deep into his skin. Kyle's breath was knocked from his lungs, which hurt almost as badly as the fresh wounds on his chest. The bear's weight pressed down on him, its growl vibrating through his bones. He raised an arm to shield his face, but the bear's teeth sank into his forearm, crushing muscle and tendon with terrifying force. Adrenaline surged through Kyle, taking over his body. He twisted, struggling to break free. He could hear his ragged gasps, the frantic pounding of his heart, and the sound of the forest closing around him. Every survival instinct screamed at him to fight, but the sheer strength of the animal was overwhelming. His vision blurred, pain swallowing every rational thought. That's when he heard the voices calling out somewhere in the distance. Footsteps crashed through the underbrush. The bear hesitated, its ears flicking toward the approaching sounds. Kyle seized the moment. With his uninjured arm, he reached for the bear spray, his fingers finally closing around the canister. He aimed mindlessly, pressing down on the nozzle. A sharp burst of aerosol erupted, filling the air between them. The bear recoiled. As suddenly as it had attacked, it turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Kyle lay still, chest heaving, his body screaming in pain. Blood seeped from deep gashes, soaking into the earth beneath him. The sound of approaching hikers grew louder, their voices filled with panic. He tried to move but collapsed, the world tilting violently around him. By the time help reached him, he was barely conscious. Someone pressed a jacket against his wounds, and another hand gripped his shoulder, steadying him. His camera, still lying where it had fallen, had captured the entire attack. This footage would later send shockwaves through his audience, igniting debates across social media about the risks of filming wildlife without proper precautions. A helicopter arrived within the hour, its blades slicing through the sky as Kyle was carefully lifted into the rescue basket. The pain was unbearable, radiating through every fiber of his body, but he was alive. As the ground fell away beneath him, the forest stretching endlessly below, he closed his eyes, his mind spinning with the weight of what had just happened. The recovery was slow and agonizing. Multiple surgeries, weeks of physical therapy, and months of psychological scars that ran deeper than the wounds on his body. His family, his mother and younger sister, had rushed to his side, their relief mixed with anger at the recklessness that had nearly cost him everything. They had always supported his passion, but had never imagined it would come this close to tragedy. When he finally returned to his channel, he didn't do so with his usual bravado or dramatic storytelling. He uploaded the unedited raw footage, allowing his viewers to witness the reality of what had happened. There are no cinematic effects, no polished narration, just the brutal, terrifying truth. The response was immediate. Some blamed him for being irresponsible and for prioritizing content over safety. Others expressed their horror and newfound respect for nature's unpredictable power. Kyle chimed in, urging people to learn from his mistake and understand the fine line between admiration and recklessness. Kyle had always believed in the importance of experiencing nature firsthand, of sharing the beauty of the wilderness with the world, but he had learned, in the most violent way possible, that some lines should never be crossed. Night after night, as he stared at the scars on his body, reminders of the day he had come face to face with raw survival, he knew one thing for certain: he would never see the wild the same way again. David, Emily, and Mark were three lifelong friends who had always embraced the wilderness, and their passion for hiking took them to some of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. They had met in an outdoor survival camp when they were kids and had since built a friendship forged through shared adventure and trust. Each had their strengths. 35-year-old David was a former park ranger with extensive knowledge of animal behavior. Emily, 33, had a background in environmental science, and her love for the wild was deeply rooted in a respect for nature's delicate balance. At 34, Mark had served in search and rescue, and his experience gave him a calm, strategic mind in high-pressure situations. They were not reckless amateurs, but seasoned hikers who understood the risks of venturing into the wild. On January 14, 2025, they embarked on a winter trek through a national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming, a journey planned for months. The snow-covered expanse stretched endlessly before them, a breathtaking yet formidable landscape. They were well equipped with thermal gear, satellite communication devices, and bear spray, a necessity even in winter when most bears should have been hibernating. They had studied the area's recent wildlife activity and saw no indication of immediate danger. But nature is unpredictable, and each trek has its risks. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the three followed the frozen riverbank, their boots crunching through the ice-crusted snow, the only noise in the silence. It was a peaceful but deceptive stillness. Unbeknownst to them, they had entered the territory of a grizzly, one that had not fully succumbed to hibernation due to food scarcity. A towering beast, underfed and desperate, had been tracking them for miles, its primal instincts driving it toward an opportunity for survival. After a few hours, they heard something. David was the first to stop, his body rigid as he turned his head toward the sound. Emily and Mark followed his gaze. At first, there was nothing but the towering pines, their branches heavy with snow. Then, a massive and purposeful blur of brown moved between the trees. The bear emerged, its eyes sunken with hunger, its breath curling into the cold air like smoke from a fire. David knew the protocol. The bear was a grizzly, one of the fiercest predators out there. Fighting it was the last thing they wanted. No, they had to make a quick but safe escape. Slowly they backed away, hands hovering near their bear spray. However, this wasn't an accidental encounter. The bear had been following them for hours, hunger gnawing at its insides. It wanted to feed. With terrifying speed, it charged, closing the distance in seconds. Emily reacted first, unclipping her canister and unleashing a powerful spray aimed at the bear's face. The chemical mist filled the air, but the bear only flinched before continuing its charge. The desperation in its movements made it clear. This was no defensive attack. This was predation. The bear slammed into David first, knocking him off his feet. A strangled cry of pain erupted from him as he struggled beneath the merciless claws. Emily and Mark lunged to his aid, Mark swinging his trekking pole at the bear's head while Emily tried another burst of bear spray. The bear roared, lifting its bloodied muzzle before snapping its jaws around David's shoulder. His agonized scream drowned out the sickening crunch of bone. The other two tried desperately to intervene, but the bear tossed David aside with terrifying ease, his body limp in the snow. Every fiber of Emily's body screamed at her to run, but she knew she couldn't abandon her friends. She grabbed a hunting knife from her belt and lunged at the bear, slashing at its thick hide. The blade barely penetrated. The bear reared up, towering over her, and came down with a force that sent her sprawling. Its claws raked across her back, shredding through her jacket and into her flesh. Blood spattered onto the pristine snow as she writhed and gasped in agony. Mark tried to drag Emily away, his mind racing for a solution, but the bear was relentless. It seized Emily, sinking its fangs into her torso. She let out a choking gasp, her struggles weakening. Mark screamed her name, swinging his ice axe at the bear's skull. The impact barely fazed it. In a final, horrifying moment, the bear lifted Emily's broken body and dragged her deeper into the trees. Mark was left panting, his vision blurred with panic. David was motionless, and Emily's body was disappearing into the shadows. He knew running was futile. His hands fumbled for his flare gun, his fingers numb and trembling. He fired into the sky, the red flare cutting through the bleak winter light. But before he could even hope for rescue, the bear turned its gaze on him. The chase was brief. Mark barely made it a few paces before the bear barreled into him, sending him crashing onto the ice-covered ground. The impact drove the air from his lungs, and before he could recover, the bear was on him, its jaws clamping around his thigh. He thrashed, clawing at the snow, the pain unlike anything he had ever known. The bear dragged him, his body leaving a crimson trail in the white landscape. The scene was eerily silent when other hikers arrived in response to the flare. The ground was disturbed with signs of struggle, and blood stained the snow in horrific streaks. No sign of the bear remained, but neither did the bodies. The tracks led deep into the forest, where the beast had carried its prey. The national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming had always been home to danger, but an attack of this magnitude was unheard of in winter. The park rangers searched extensively, recovering their remains scattered through the wilderness. The bear was later tracked down and euthanized, but the scars left by its rampage would never fade. For their families, the grief was unimaginable. David had been a devoted brother to his younger sister, who had often looked up to him as her protector. Emily's parents had always feared her passion for the wild would lead to tragedy, and their worst nightmare had come true. Mark had left behind an aging mother for whom he had been the last family she had left. The story became a grim cautionary tale, a reminder that no matter how experienced one was, no one was immune to nature's raw, unrelenting force. For all its beauty, the wilderness remained an unforgiving place where survival was never guaranteed.